Well, good morning and good afternoon, everyone. I'm Elliot Kallen, President of Prosperity Financial Group, and I'd like to welcome you to another episode of Meet the Expert. Very exciting, super topical right now. The world's kind of getting all goofy on us, but we're going to make sure that we understand today how the trend of the marketplace when it comes to environmentally social governance, when it comes to understanding the electric car industry, understanding alternative energy, and how that works from not just from understanding it, but from the investment standpoint, something that quote unquote the younger generation is somewhat interested in, because there's no doubt about it that from the vehicle world, from the power world, we are going away from fossil fuels. So we're going to talk about that a little bit today. And we're going to talk with Jonathan Bauman. Jonathan is a vice president of American Century Investments. Very exciting. Jonathan, thanks for being here.
Sure, Elliot. Thanks for having me.
Great. So let's ask Jonathan some questions. He's a CFA. He's got all types of credentials on sustainable energy. So we're going to get rid of those concepts on sustainable energy and see if we can grill him a little bit so we all understand what's going on in that business. So let's just define this. So if we first, before we get into electric vehicles, Jonathan, let's define what is sustainable. What does that word mean? Because when I think of sustainable, I think of crops. When I think of energy, I don't think of that being sustainable, because wind is just so-so and solar is just so-so, cloudy days, dry days, and so forth. What is sustainable and where are we going with this?
Yeah, it's a great question, Elliot. And obviously there's a lot of talk about sustainability and ESG in the marketplace today. And as we think about sustainability, it's ultimately things that can be durable over longer periods of time. So you think of fossil fuels, there's a finite amount of fossil fuels available, right? But the wind, even though it doesn't blow all the time, blows pretty consistently every day, right? Most days. The sun doesn't shine every single day, but we have a pretty good idea that the sun's going to continue to shine. And so to be able to harness those forms of energy alongside storing that energy and being able to distribute that energy, ultimately, we believe over time can be more sustainable. And ultimately, power the economy that continues to grow and continues to demand more and more power needs, right? And so it's that transition away from a resource that is finite to something that is more durable, and ultimately that sustainability can be more of a generator of economic growth moving forward.
Great. So let's just go right into this if we could, and that's talk about batteries, because all this is based on batteries. I'm a little confused why we don't have a hydrogen industry, but I'd love for you to touch on that. But let's talk about what we do have, which is batteries, cars with batteries, homes with batteries, solar is going to batteries. Obviously, the big brand out there is Tesla. Everybody knows that. It's a trending thing. People buy Teslas because they want to be in front of the curve and so forth and so on. So let's talk about the batteries and what's going on with that, because we're still at 300, 400, 500 miles per charge. What do we need to do to get to 1,000? What's going on out there?
Yeah, so I think if you think about batteries in general, right, they've come a long way, both in their capabilities, right, the amount of energy that they can store and transmit efficiently, and also they've come down significantly in price. So if we just think of from auto perspective, if you look at the price of the battery pack in a vehicle, we've seen that come down over 80% just in the last 8 years. And in terms of the amount of cost per kilowatt hour, right? So for the amount of energy that you're getting. And so that's really been a big driver in this inflection that we've seen in demand for electric vehicles, because the cost has become more achievable, if you will, to the average investor, or excuse me, the average consumer. To your point, Tesla was the early leader here. They've always had a premium product, right? They started with the Model S, which is a very expensive sedan, the Model X, a very expensive SUV, and then in recent years have launched more, which you could define as more mainstream sedans and SUVs, the Model 3 and the Model Y, and that really was driven by lower cost of batteries, right? More efficient batteries and lower cost. And at the same time as you've seen costs come down, you've also seen the efficiency of the battery and therefore the miles that you can go on a charge an electric vehicle increase, right? Most vehicles coming out to market today are over 300 miles range. You think back to the Nissan Leaf, which was one of the early vehicles out there and sort of the middle of the market from a pricing standpoint. It was 75 miles to a charge, which for most people didn't really work very well. So I think as we've passed the 300-mile range, there's some cars now that are like the Lucid Air that's targeting 500 miles. Some of the newer, larger vehicles like SUVs that are coming out that, because they're larger, have more capability to have more batteries on board, are going to also target larger distances. And so I think that sort of complementary effect of cost coming down, efficiency going up, are really helping scratch that itch for consumers around the price point in order to buy an electric vehicle. And then also the concern that they may have had around range is also now less of a concern. And that's really been the driver of this sharp increase in growth, really almost 100% year-over-year growth in electric vehicles in the US in 2021 versus 2020. And that's an environment where we have supply chain issues, and auto manufacturers can't build as many cars as they could probably sell. And so we think that trend continues, and we can expect to see very strong growth going forward. And if you want, we can dive into some of the drivers of that. But in general, kind of back to your original question, batteries have allowed us to store and transmit energy much more efficiently and at a lower cost than what we're able to do.
Great. And let me also tell people, since I forgot to do it early on, how to reach me and how to reach us in the future. It's my email address is Elliot@prosperityfinancialgroup.com. That's ELLIOT @prosperityfinancialgroup.com. Our website is www.prosperityfinancialgroup.com. And you could also call us at 925-314-8503. And we encourage everybody to reach out to us with questions about this or any other financial questions that you might have. So I want to go back to the word driver. And I don't mean the person driving a car, but what's driving the industry, because we're seeing unbelievable growth. Now, profitability and making money, it is a whole nother conversation. And I do want to talk about, as an investor, how does one take advantage of this? Or is this one of those long-term plays here? So let's talk about what are the key drivers. Tesla seems to be leading the charge, but there are a lot of key drivers in the industry.
Yeah, so I'd say if we think about the key drivers of adoption of battery electric vehicles, it really, in my view, falls into three buckets. The first is what we'll call the regulatory sticks. So you think of a stick, sort of something that's prodding you to move ahead, right? And those things are increasingly driven by the government, right? So whether it's emission mandates, Europe, for example, has a Fit for 55 climate plan where they're targeting a 55% reduction in emissions by 2030. In the US, we have the CAFE standards. Sometimes that's mandates, right? So in the case of governments really putting mandates out there and targets that they want to hit. So the Biden administration, for example, is targeting 50% penetration of zero emission vehicles by 2030. And recently signed an executive order targeting 100% zero emission vehicles for the government by 2035. I know, Elliot, you're based in California. They've got a model basically saying that 20% of new sales must be zero emission by 2025, which is not that far away, and are targeting 100% by 2035. And of course, outside of the US and other parts of the world, in Europe and China, there's similar types of mandates. So that first bucket, those regulatory sticks, are really changing the rules of the road, if you will, to mix metaphors there, and ultimately driving consumer behavior because essentially it's the law. The second bucket is what I'll call the incentive carrots, right? So you have sticks you can prod people with, you have carrots you can sort of hopefully entice them along with. And similarly, these are driven primarily by the government, but it's things like ultimately tax incentives or subsidies. Not that we really have those here in the US in terms of subsidies, but they are widespread in Europe and China. And in fact, in Europe, there's certain countries and vehicles where you can get up to 9,000 euros in a subsidy to buy an electric vehicle. In the US, we've done it more from a tax subsidy, a tax incentive. So most new electric vehicles in the US, there's a $7,500 federal tax rebate, essentially. Now, that is phased out for manufacturers once they reach 200,000 vehicles. So Tesla and GM have run out of those tax incentives at this point. But there is talk and new legislation that's being proposed that would remove that 200,000 unit cap for manufacturers and ultimately even potentially increase from $7,500 to $10,000 those tax incentives. And so more to come on that in terms of what legislation may ultimately make it through the current administration. But those incentives definitely are a big driver as well. And then the last bucket, and I think we've already touched on this a little bit, so I won't belabor this one too much, but it's really the addressing of the consumer concerns that have held many consumers back up to this point. And it's things like the range, right? We've talked about how range has increased significantly to help reduce that range anxiety. It's the proliferation of charging points. So, Tesla's built out their network. Many local municipalities in partnership with utility companies are building out charging stations. Again, back to the Biden administration, their goal is to build out 500,000 charging points as part of the infrastructure bill that was recently proposed. And then lastly, again, we touched on this too, is that falling battery prices and the fact that in reality, internal combustion vehicles have gotten pretty expensive too. You've seen this narrowing of the gap, right, between an electric vehicle and a traditional internal combustion engine vehicle. And oh, by the way, electric vehicles in general have a lot of the characteristics that consumers like: really good acceleration, the lower maintenance costs, right? You don't have to do oil changes. You don't have to worry about all these internal parts that can break down in an engine. So you're seeing all those consumer concerns really being addressed as that third driver of this acceleration and adoption that we've seen.
So on the negative side of electric vehicles, because we should discuss this, and we're talking with Jonathan Bauman, who's a vice president and portfolio manager at American Century Investments out of Kansas City. As one of the drivers here, I'm an environmentally conscious person no matter what I do. I don't think I'm over the top with it, but I'm trying to be very aware of what's going on around me. And I know that batteries have, the disintegration of batteries is just awful. They go in landfills and they basically will last forever with horribly destructive, poisonous materials, cadmium, lithium, heavy metals that cause all types of terrible things when they get into the water supply or whatever. These are in every electric vehicle. So I know as environmentally conscious people are buying electric cars because that's one of the drivers, but nobody's talking about this. So why aren't we talking about this?
Yeah, well, I think part of it is it's not an issue today, right? As oftentimes we tend to focus on what's right in front of us instead of what's maybe a concern 10, 15, 20 plus years down the road. And today, you think of most of the electric vehicles on the road, they haven't been around long enough for their batteries to degrade and have to be scrapped, right? And so there just isn't that concern that people are talking about, but you bring up a very good point, and it is a real risk. And the manufacturers are already thinking ahead of us and addressing that. So, Tesla, for example, has recycled every single used Tesla that's no longer useful, and used all of those materials that are in those batteries to go towards the manufacturing of new batteries. Ford made a huge investment in a battery recycler. Other auto manufacturers are doing similar things. And you're already starting to see this battery recycling industry take off. Now, none of these are publicly traded companies yet, but there's the materials that come out of the manufacturing process of batteries that are currently being recycled anyway. And then if you add these expired batteries, for lack of a better term, to the recycling food chain, that's going to continue to eliminate those larger batteries that end up in the landfills and also help reduce the cost of manufacturing future batteries, right? Because you're recycling those materials that you no longer have to mine. So, I think there's going to be this curve where we still have to mine a lot of the materials that go into these batteries, and a lot of that can be more harmful to the environment. But once we have those and in batteries and have the process of recycling and reusing those materials to manufacture fresher batteries that go in newer vehicles, that really reduces that environmental risk that you could see potentially being a challenge for this industry.
And I want to stay on that same subject for a second, and that is the metals being used in batteries come from some areas of the world that are fairly unstable, Africa and China. And China is, Well, we used to have a love affair with China. Then we slowly began a love-hate affair with China. And that love is getting tarnished now. I like them and I hate them all at the same time affair, and I need them. But there's no doubt about it that China, with their Silk Road policy, has captured the markets on these battery metals. So what's the future there if we're unable to get materials? And if we ever were to go to war with China, do all of our electric tanks die?
Yeah, it's a great question. It kind of reminds me of the same concerns we had back in the 70s when all of our oil came from the Middle East, which, also we've had love-hate affairs with and are politically unstable, right? And so it's always a challenge, whether you're talking about internal combustion engines or electric vehicles. The fuel that you need isn't necessarily in your backyard, right? I do think over time, technology wins, and we'll either figure out a way to use other materials in the production of batteries that are, we're going to be less dependent, if you will, on those parts of the world that those can be more challenging. So I think that's part of it. And we haven't really explored, other ways or other places where it can be manufactured either, right? We've seen that's where the mining of those materials has been to this point. But you think, again, back to the 70s, we didn't produce any oil in the US hardly, right? You look at the technology that enabled us to really become self-sufficient in production of fossil fuels in the US, and even become a net exporter at one point in time. I wonder if there's similar capabilities and technologies that can be found to address the electric vehicle space going forward as well. So I think that's an important component. But you're right. I mean, today the global cell suppliers are largely Asian companies like Panasonic, SK Innovations, LG, and they source their materials from other parts of the world that you do have to worry about demand, if you will, outstripping supply, at least in the near term. But there's a lot of investment, a lot of technological innovation going on in this space, and ultimately, we think that even battery technology is changing to where some of those materials, like cobalt, for example, may not even be needed in future battery technology.
So if I'm an oil company or I'm an investor in an oil company, and again, we're talking with Jonathan Bauman, and I'm Elliot Kallen from Prosperity Financial Group. So it's ELLIOT at prosperityfinancialgroup.com or prosperityfinancialgroup.com for our website. If we are, Chevron and Mobil and ExxonMobil and Shell, Royal Dutch, am I shaking in my boots? Should I, as an investor, should I run wherever they go? I go the opposite. What's the future here?
Yeah, so it's something that I think is interesting in that the answer to that question may be different 50 years from now than it is today. But if you look at the market share of electric vehicles in the U.S., we ended 2021 at a little over 3%. Right, so the opposite of that, obviously, let's call it a little less than 97% of vehicles on the road still need fuel, and so those companies aren't going away. Right, clearly there's going to be demand for their products, and ultimately, they're not going to zero anytime soon. But I do think many of those companies have recognized the importance of diversifying, if you will, their exposure to fossil fuels and investing in other forms of renewable energy, and also recognizing that there is potential financial risk to their business models if they don't adapt. And that comes in the forms of either what we call stranded assets, so the oil that they get credit for today that's in the ground that may never have to come out of the ground, or it can be in the form of potential fines and increased regulation as well, if we continue to see a lot of the regulatory environment pushing away from fossil fuels. So companies, large companies, I'd say the U.S. companies are a bit behind the European ones like Royal Dutch Shell or BP. In terms of investing in renewables, but they're moving that direction, and ultimately will be addressing those concerns over the coming years and decades.
All right, we're going to get back to oil a little bit later in the show here, but Tesla's the leader. There's no doubt about it. Is Tesla the leader because they make a great product, or is Tesla the leader because Elon Musk is just a maverick and brilliant and the Einstein of our time and all the other great accolades?
Yeah, I think it's probably a bit of both. They do make a very good product. They had the benefit, right, of not having a legacy automobile business, which is, challenging to try to thread that needle of still supporting internal combustion engine operations and manufacturing and marketing and all of that, while also trying to launch an electric vehicle. They were able to really start with a clean sheet and build from scratch and vertically integrate. And that's key, right? They control everything. The research, the design, the manufacturing, the hardware, the software. They're really a technology company more so than a vehicle company. And that differentiation has allowed them to create a better product, right? Their technology has given them a significant lead over other manufacturers in terms of their batteries, the energy density, the power, the weight, the cost, all of that. They really lead the industry in, which has allowed them to be successful from a battery standpoint. And in manufacturing, they've done a good job, right? They went through, as Elon Musk called it, the manufacturing hell when they were first scaling up, but they've kind of come through that now and really have figured out a model and have even replicated that elsewhere in the world to be able to mass produce vehicles efficiently on now 2 and soon 3 continents. So yeah, and then lastly, I'd say that the fact that they own their own software has really been a competitive advantage to them. The ability to do over-the-air updates consistently, anytime there are issues, to be able to address those without you having to take your vehicle into a dealership. That's been a huge advantage for them as well. Especially as you compare them to the traditional auto manufacturers that really outsource a lot of that to other manufacturers, right? And don't control that end product as much as Tesla does. So, I'd say that to summarize, they were early, right? Which helped them build a brand and a reputation. They've done a really good job with the products that they've launched. So there's been some manufacturing issues. You've heard of concerns around gaps in panels and software glitches and things. That's all normal, I think, for newer companies. But they've addressed most of those and improved. And so that's really made them that leader in the clubhouse, right? If you look at their market share in the U.S. today, it's over 75% or close to 75%, right? The Model Y's got 39% of the battery electric vehicle market. The Model 3 is 29%. The Model S is about 5%. So you add all that up, you're a little over 70%. But that's a big chunk of what's still a really small pie. And so while they're the current leader, I do think their overall share of the battery electric vehicle market will decrease over time. I don't think they can hold that 70+%, but because the overall pie is going to continue to expand, we think they can continue to grow significantly into the foreseeable future.
So my father was a staunch GM supporter, and I'm a Ford product person for as long as I can remember. And I drive a Lincoln and Aviator, and it used to be a Navigator before that. And I like these companies. I want Ford to succeed doing this, but I'm concerned that these companies, a GM with his pension that didn't get fixed when they filed bankruptcy, and they never fixed that. Their overhead's killing them and putting them out of business. Am I worried for nothing? And do they have a shot at taking on Tesla?
I do. I think they have a shot. And in fact, the Mustang Mach-E, which I don't know if you've taken a look at that, Elliot, that seems like that might be in your wheelhouse. It's now up to 6% market share of battery electric vehicles, right? So it's number 3 behind the Model Y and the Model 3. And so, and that's in a very short period of time. That product just came out last year. So I do think the legacy manufacturers have an opportunity here. One, they have huge scale. So to your point, they've got big R&D budgets. They can put that to use to develop battery and EV platforms. 2, they've got brand awareness. Similarly, my dad and grandpa were both big Ford guys. I'm a Ford guy myself. And so, that brand awareness and sort of that brand loyalty, if you will, is very powerful. And I think Ford especially, and even GM have been smart about leveraging very popular vehicles, right? The Mustang Mach-E, the F-150 Lightning, right? Their new electric truck that's coming out later this year. GM's bringing back the Hummer brand, but doing it in an electric vehicle. They've got this brand awareness that's really powerful that other startup companies just don't have. And then a third point, the marketing muscle, right? They have huge marketing budgets. You probably watched the Super Bowl over the weekend. High number of electric vehicle ads. Not a single one was a Tesla or a Rivian or any of these other startups. They were all major manufacturers and leveraging that marketing muscle. And then I think there's opportunities for them too over time. Just the complexity of electric vehicles is lower, as we talked about, right? Fewer moving parts. They'll have greater share in the economics, the more of that manufacturing that they control. And so some of the economics that a Tesla is able to glean because of that vertical integration, I think that could ultimately benefit the traditional auto manufacturers once they navigate through that transition. And candidly, that's going to be the hardest part, is how do you shift from internal combustion engine manufacturing to electric vehicle manufacturing? How do you navigate through the challenges of a unionized workforce that now needs to be retrained and repurposed, right? Because the engine guys, what are they going to do, right? They're not making engines anymore, right? So you have to think about all those potential issues, stranded assets, things like that could be more of a challenge in the near term. But I think they're positioned well, again, given all those things we talked about around their scale, their brand awareness, their marketing muscle. And I think they're taking the right approach to essentially just build electrified versions of vehicles that people already know and love.
Great. So anyway, we're talking to Jonathan Bauman of American Century, obviously about electric cars right now. We'll broaden that out in a few minutes to sustainable investing and sustainable companies and how do you define that outside the electric world. Got a few more questions about vehicles. I'm Elliot Kallen, Prosperity Financial Group, 925-314-8503. Well, Jonathan, let's talk about these startups besides Tesla, because the early 20th century was filled with car companies that don't exist today. Hudson, Plymouth, DeLorean it's 1970s. Lots of cars that don't exist that are worth a lot of money if you have them today. And I wish I had a handful of Packard cars in my garage. And I lived for a while right by the old Packard plant in Boonton, New Jersey. So I know what that is. But let's talk about some of those startups, the Rivian, the Lucid, the Fisker, and so forth. I have clients that say, let's get me this, let's get me that. I feel like sometimes we're in a wild west of electrical car startups, just like Bitcoin and Ethereum is the wild west of coins. What's their future, if you would?
Yeah, it's a great question. And to be fair, Elliot, there's lots of brands that were once part of Ford and GM and Stellantis or Chrysler that no longer exist either, right? Pontiac, Mercury, those no longer exist. And I think that's normal, right? Consumer preferences change, brands evolve. And I think that's going to be the same for the electric vehicles as well. There's startups that will survive and become reasonable companies. And then there's many that probably will just go away or get absorbed perhaps by some of the manufacturers just to gain greater scale and technology. But there are some that we do think are positioned well based on what we've seen so far. And all of them benefit from the same sort of dynamic that Tesla benefited from, in that there's none of the baggage from legacy assets or a workforce or processes. You really get to start fresh with a clean sheet and design from the bottom up these vehicles, the software, all of the materials and stuff that goes in them, which gives those companies a lot of flexibility and able to scale. So I think that the challenge that all of them are going to have is finding their share of voice and finding the customer loyalty. Tesla didn't build it overnight. It's taken them quite a while, and now, especially in California where you are, Elliot, they're ubiquitous, almost ubiquitous. 10% market share Tesla now has in the state of California, which is pretty impressive. Do I think all of these startups can get there? Of course not. But we think there's some that are positioned well given the niche that they've focused on. And I'd say the one that we're most excited about is actually Rivian. And it's a company that we've had the ability to meet with all of their management, tour their plant before they went public last November, and really think they're positioned well given their focus on really kind of what they call adventure vehicles. But essentially it's pickup trucks and sport utility vehicles that really currently haven't been addressed by the battery electric vehicle market. Now, obviously, there's coming the coming models from the major manufacturers, but I think Rivian's got enough of a head start and a unique enough of a product, and candidly at a price point that seems very attractive relative to what you're seeing from some of the other options that are out there. And so we are really excited about what they're doing. They obviously have, as you probably know, a huge investment from Amazon. So they've got a contract to produce 100,000 electric delivery vehicles for Amazon. And they're not just giving them the chassis, they partnered with Amazon to create software, workflow management tools, really built these spec to what Amazon needed for their business. But that gives them opportunities to do that for other delivery companies as well. So that provides, I think, some of the potential safety net, if you will, beyond just the consumer vehicles that they have. But so far, everything that we've seen on their truck, which launched towards the end of last year, and then their SUV, which has only really launched to their founder so far, but is coming later this year, just very impressive in terms of capabilities, in terms of the quality of the build and the materials. Obviously, the jury's still out how quality exists 5-10 years from now, but from what we've seen so far, we think that likely is a survivor and can benefit and scale really quickly. It has very strong demand in that more niche area of the market around adventure vehicles. I'd say kind of similar in terms of brand philosophy to that of a Jeep, for example, right? They're not going to do today, at least, any sort of passenger vehicles, sedans, really focused on that, people that like to get out and have more of an adventure type experience, or candidly, they just like to look like they're having an adventure in the mall parking lot. But at any rate, you think of the types of vehicles that are out there today. Your Lincoln Aviator, great example of that. But also your Land Rovers and your BMW SUVs and your Volvo SUVs, right? Those are all sort of ubiquitous, and I think Rivian plugs into that very well with the models that they have.
Now, Rivian was part of Ford, and then spun off, and Ford got $30 or $40 billion, give or take. What's a billion here and a billion there, and infused because they took them public and they own part of them. Isn't Ford also the beneficiary here of Rivian?
Yeah, Ford is. So that's they weren't technically part of Ford, but Ford was an early investor, along with Amazon, along with some other investment companies. Though they were all early investors in Rivian when it was private. So it was still owned by the founder, R.J. Scaringe, but Ford definitely had an equity stake, if you will, in Rivian. And there was talk early on that they were going to partner. Rivian's the technology they have, the way they build their vehicles, they call it a skateboard. So if you can visually think of a skateboard, which is essentially the battery pack and then an electric motor on each of the four wheels. And so there was talk early on that you could basically take a Ford F-150 chassis and just sort of sit it on the Rivian skateboard. And that might be a quicker way to get to market for Ford. And obviously Ford's decided to kind of go their own direction. I think, again, kind of back to the comment I had earlier, they'd rather control and have more vertical integration where they can. But as a result of that, though, you're right. Ford was an investor. They benefited from the IPO, a massive one-time gain in their Q4 results, and again helped Rivian get to where they are today. Because these companies do not become viable without big investors up front, because it's huge, as you can imagine, cost to build a brand new company from scratch that's very capital intensive. You got to build a manufacturing plant. You got to source all the materials. You got to build the whole network of salespeople and service people and everything else. And so Amazon, Ford, others really provided that initial chunk of assets. And then when they went public in November of last year, the capital markets helped provide another big chunk that really allow them to spend and keep building manufacturing plants over the coming years, even though they really have no revenues at this point. So
we're talking with Jonathan Bauman from American Century Investments, who is the expert on sustainable electrical cars, sustainable energy, and he's also a portfolio manager and a vice president there. I'm Elliot Kallen, Prosperity Financial Group, and Elliot, E-L-L-I-O-T, at prosperityfinancialgroup.com or 925-314-8503 or prosperityfinancialgroup.com. So I want to ask you one more question about vehicles, if I could, Jonathan, because this has been great information for a lot of people. And I know for some people, it's dry. It's like sitting in a college classroom and like, oh my goodness, is this the same guy that wrote the book? I'm dying over here. So it's hard to put humor in here, but I do want to talk for a moment about the hydrogen car, because was an early proponent of the hydrogen car. I tried to invest in that world. I thought somewhere we're going to come up with a safe hydrogen car that's not going to explode from the compression of hydrogen. And then when I was really jazzed up when I found out there was a pickup truck from Europe where they put hydrogen. It's a hydrogen pickup truck in Europe that's being tested, I think coming out of Poland, and they actually had as the hydrogen burnt down, so to speak, it burnt up, it turned into water vapor, and they had a little water cooler inside the pickup truck that was filling up your bottle with purified water. It was an amazing concept on that, but I don't see now. So I've gone from I'm excited about it to I'm disillusioned that it may never happen. Is there a future for hydrogen anywhere in this country now in the energy world?
I think there's a future for hydrogen, but I think it's going to be in heavier vehicles than passenger vehicles. And what I mean by that is your, tractor trailers transporting goods, and the reason for that is really the just space that you need in order to store enough hydrogen to deliver the energy to get you where you need to go. It's really hard to get that into a vehicle because hydrogen really is not as efficient at sort of that production of energy as we're getting currently from batteries, right? So the challenge with batteries with a tractor trailer is you just need so much of them, and they take up a ton of space, and ultimately it's just not very efficient. But if you can do it in hydrogen, you do see with tractor trailers the ability to have more compression, more storage, and ultimately deliver the power that you need. So we think that likely is where hydrogen will go. It's early. The other challenge you have with hydrogen is to produce it today takes a lot of electricity, right? So in order to produce hydrogen, whether you're in Air Products or Air Liquide or one of the major manufacturers there, it takes what they call electrolysis, but ultimately you lose a lot of the energy in the process of doing that. So again, this is kind of in the weeds type stuff. I don't want to get too far in the weeds, but ultimately our view is hydrogen for vehicles is going to be more challenging, just given the properties of hydrogen and the ability to convert hydrogen into electricity is more of a challenge. But ultimately, we do think that the infrastructure may get there for heavier vehicles to make it more interesting going forward, where batteries maybe don't work as well for the heavy vehicles, but are more attractive in passenger vehicles.
So speaking of heavy vehicles for a moment, we all know that America runs on trucks. There's a move to go self-driving trucks, given what just happened in Canada, and how many people are employed in the trucking industry. I think that's a big political football on trying to get rid of 3 million drivers in this country and replace them with computers. So I don't see that happening tomorrow. We'll see on this, but I don't understand why we know everybody has been behind trucks that spew out black smoke from the diesel, not just burning, but most of the diesel that we see is unburnt diesel. It's even worse than burnt diesel. It's unburnt and just going into the air uncaptured. But I don't understand, and maybe you could tell me, if we want to go clean, and again, that environmentally conscious world that we want to be clean, why aren't we replacing every diesel engine in America with propane engines and putting in propane tanks where we have an almost unlimited supply to put our hands around liquid propane gas?
Yeah, I think it's just the sheer infrastructure challenges. If you drive across, I'm in the middle of the country, right? I drive across Kansas today. There's pretty much a massive truck stop every other exit, right? That's got diesel and the infrastructure in order to refuel vehicles. And I think you've seen companies that control their own fleets, and like UPS, for example, has increasingly more natural gas powered vehicles, compressed natural gas, and And ultimately, I think the technology is there when you have your own refueling plan and you kind of go back to the same place every day. The infrastructure is not there if you're an over-the-truck driver and you've got to pull off the road and refuel every once in a while. And it just hasn't been as big of a focus as maybe it should be to get the technology there. But that's, to me today, the biggest limiting factor is just that infrastructure. In order to get the propane or natural gas refueling, if you will, infrastructure in the same places where we currently have diesel.
Okay, so it's an infrastructure problem. So let's leave the electric car alone for a moment and come back to it if we could. And let's talk about a little broader in the market, sustainable investing, sustainable companies, and so forth if we could, because you're in that world every day. And you're investing in the portfolios that you manage in sustainable, because that's what your title is, sustainable. And we have your products in many of our portfolios, sustainable investing. And of course, coming to California, we get asked that question. So we've been in the last few years increasing the amount of exposure in sustainable environmental investing only if it makes sense, not just for the sake of doing it. So let's talk about what that means in a broader sense, not just about the electric car and sustainable investing, and does that make economic sense as well?
Yeah, I think it depends on how you do it, candidly, Elliot. So what we've seen really in the last 5 years or 10 years now in the US market is this transition away from when most people thought about ESG or sustainable investing in the past, it was typically, I don't want to own whatever, right? Whether it's I don't want to own energy or I don't want to own sin stocks. It was more about excluding companies entirely. And really what we've seen in the last 5-10 years is this transition more to let's integrate environmental, social, and governance risk factors into our traditional analysis, right? So there's financial things that are important to the value of a company, but there's these other intangible things that relate to their impact on the environment and how they treat their employees and how they protect their customer data and how their board is structured so there's good oversight. All those things are potential risks and opportunities that all companies face. And is there a way to identify which companies are managing those risks better than other companies that you can invest in and integrate that into your analysis? And so as we think about it with our sustainable equity portfolio, it's less about trying to exclude entire sectors or industries, but more about within each sector, which companies do we think ultimately can outperform over time because they're managing these risks better or because they're taking advantage of opportunities that relate to impact on the environment, social issues, and governance issues. And so that more integrated approach, and even we take it a step further and we sort of intentionally overweight what we call ESG leaders and underweight ESG laggards, we believe over time that actually allows you to outperform a broad market more consistently because you're managing risk, right? It's really about risk management. You get benefits from it as well, right? For those investors that want to own companies that do have less impact on the planet, we can say our portfolio holdings produce fewer greenhouse gas emissions. They use less energy. They use less water, right? We can illustrate that to investors that yes, the companies they invest in are doing better than if they just own the S&P 500 more broadly. But importantly, we do it because you get those benefits in addition to, we think, better relative performance over time. And that's different than if you just exclude certain parts of the economy, because in our view, there's times where certain parts of the economy can work really well. And by excluding those, it makes your performance less consistent, right? Last year was a great example, right? Energy was up almost 100%, right? And so you had a lot of strategies that exclude energy really struggled to deliver good performance last year. But if you can say, well, within energy, we think ConocoPhillips, who has a net zero target and has been reducing their carbon footprint and divesting high carbon intensive things like Canadian sands, can outperform. Let's overweight that company and let's avoid these others that aren't making those same investments. We're still going to have some energy exposure, but it's, we think, the cleanest shirt and the dirty laundry, if you will. And over time, those companies are going to outperform.
Good. So, as we are on the front lines here, and, I have to tell you something, that when our clients say, how am I doing? Which is the first question after how are you? How am I doing? And I have to say, well, you're down because it's been a funky market this year, or you're up because it wasn't a funky market and we're in the right spot. Very hard to make money right now. It's such a choppy market. Nobody says, well, that's okay as long as we have a zero carbon footprint. I don't get that. I don't get that as a follow-up.
No, and I think you're right. First and foremost, we're all capitalists, right? We invest to, save for retirement or save for our kids' college. Like that's why we invest, and so we want to do that. But if you can do that in a way that actually delivers potentially more consistent performance and have less impact, that's really what we're striving to do.
Yeah, I know when we talk about the Oracle of Omaha here, and he's the number one owner of railroads in the world, I think at this point. Railroads don't run on batteries. They run on coal and diesel, and so he's certainly does not have a zero carbon footprint. He says his biggest carbon footprint probably as the state you live in is Kansas or Missouri over there. So it's and nobody's challenging that and saying, oh yeah, but he's only up X number of percent in the last 40 years. And what does he know? He's polluting the world. That's just not how people think.
Right.
We all want cleaner air, water, and environment better for our children. And we had it yesterday, but we all want to make money at the same time.
Yeah, I think the good thing is, though, just to kind of take a little quick segue here, is because of the increased focus by investors on ESG issues, companies are paying attention to it, right? They're aligning CEO compensation goals to their environmental footprint. They're incentivized now to reduce where they can that environmental impact, right? And so you do get that long-term benefit, right? It still doesn't completely eliminate greenhouse gas emissions, right? We're still going to have those, but to the extent companies are incentivized to pay attention to these things more so than they would have 10, 15 years ago, because investors are demanding it, I think that's important.
So just to throw politics in here, if I could, because there's all these decisions about sustainability are also based on political decisions and not just economic decisions. So it's very interesting. Just a few years ago, we declared ourselves energy independent, and we no longer need Middle East oil. But politics as an ebb and flow world that we live in, depending on who's in office and who's not, and I'm not criticizing either party or either side right now, but the party in power today has said, I'd rather not see energy produced in this US because it's not clean to produce energy. Even though we are the cleanest producers in the world of it, it's better out of sight. Put it offshore, put it where it belongs, which are in the Middle East, which are the biggest polluters for producing energy in the world. But because we don't see it, it must be okay. And then the complaint about, well, I don't want to see 10 square miles of solar batteries in front of me. Obviously, not going to be best solar mirrors in front of me because it's an eyesore. So let's put it somewhere where you can't see it anymore. So there's the politics of that too. And the politics of we're not putting any money into the power grid in the US because nobody cares. That's the politics of it. Not that we shouldn't do it, but that's the politics of it. And then there's also the politics of the people that say, well, I love these ESG companies, and I'm going to pick on Apple for a moment. You and I have talked about Apple, and some portfolios that are ESG friendly, Apple is the number one holding. I know it's not number one with you, but Apple produces literally every product in China that they make, or parts of every product are made in China. China is horrible as an ESG friendly manufacturer. They have a horrible track record. They're producing opening coal plants at record levels, more open in China than almost any other part of the world combined. That's how quickly they're opening up. So they're the biggest polluters, and they remind me of what happened in Japan in the 1920s and 30s when we were selling them all of our scrap metal and they were producing bombs and airplanes to be used against us in the future. So I worry about my children's future when big corporate America is in bed with or in love with Chinese money right now. So throwing politics in there, and I know you're not a political prognosticator, and I'm not asking you to take a stand. There are a lot of things that don't align with core values of environmentally sensitive investing. They align with political values. So what do we tell our clients that say, hey, I want to be clean, I want to be green, I want to be this, but I want to make money. So get me more of this because I want more of it. What do we tell them?
Yeah, it's tough. I mean, honestly, I think it's really hard to be 100% clean, to use that term, if that's even a thing, and be a large cap multinational corporation, right? It's virtually impossible. And that's why we have to take a relative perspective and, again, say which companies are at least doing better than their peers and which companies are doing worse. And let's be overweight those that we think are doing better and underweight those that we think are doing worse. But recognizing there is, you're right, politics play a huge part of it. And they change incentives, they change consumer behavior, they change corporate behavior. So we have to be mindful of those things when we evaluate companies and where are the political winds growing. So whether that's large cap technology companies and concerns over data privacy and them being too big and having too much power, whether that's your Apple conversation and where things are manufactured. Those are all things we have to think about. But I think at the end of the day, it's really a function of figuring out what do we think the future enterprise value of a company is going to be? How much are we willing to pay for that? And what potential roadblocks get in the way of that? And some of those can be financial, but increasingly, if you look at companies today, majority of what's driving their value is not physical things. It's not their property, plant, and equipment. It's their brand reputation. It's their patents. It's their human capital. All these things that are really harder to kind of put dollars and cents around, but have an important component of that valuation of the company. And that's where we're spending increasingly more of our time. But it's a big blender. You have to throw it all in there. And there's some things that are good and some things that are bad, right? You sort of like you hide the vegetables in the the blender there, so the kids still eat whatever it is you're making. It's the same sort of thing, right? There's companies that have really good aspects of what they do, and then they have some things that aren't so good, and you have to weigh all that together and figure out when you compare them to their peers, are they at least taking steps to get better at the things that are good and reduce the things that are bad? And that's really where we spend a lot of our time.
So we're talking to Jonathan Bauman because as financial advisors, financial planners, Prosperity Financial Group, we have to make money for our clients, and we use the American Century products because they invest sustainably, and we think that's the way to go too, or we wouldn't be having this conversation. So thank you, Jonathan. I do have one more question for you, maybe two, just as we begin to wrap this up right now. And maybe you can't answer this, and that's maintenance. I buy my Tesla, I buy my Rivian, I buy my car, or lease it really doesn't matter. I have to maintain it. And traditionally, I know from having internal combustion engines for my lifetime, I've got to get the oil changed. I have to get the tires rotated. There's Jiffy Lube, let's grease, let's oil, let's do all these ancillary things. And then once every 100,000 miles, we change the spark plugs. It used to be every 20, now it's 100,000 miles. They're not even called spark plugs anymore. They're just called plugs or glow plugs or whatever we call them. There's an air filter that needs changing every now and then. There's brake fluids. What has to be done on these electric vehicles?
Not much, shockingly. And I think that's one of the benefits, right? You obviously don't have any of the maintenance that comes with the traditional engine, transmission, cooling system, all of those sorts of, basically everything that's under your hood of your internal combustion engine today, that all goes away. None of that needs to be maintained anymore. You don't have belts. You don't have, the everything that sort of sits on the belt, your air conditioning compressor, all that sort of stuff is not connected to the engine anymore. So you don't have those. There's still going to be your traditional things like tires, right? Those are still going to wear out. And in fact, one of the sort of hidden things that people maybe don't realize with electric vehicles is they're typically heavier than their internal combustion engine counterpart. Batteries are heavy. So there's probably, depending on how you drive, maybe a little more wear and tear on your tires on an electric vehicle than you might have on an internal combustion engine. But brakes, interestingly enough, and this is maybe contrary to what you might think, brakes actually last really long on most electric vehicles because they all, for the most part, at least as far as I know, use something called regenerative braking. So when you let off the accelerator of an electric vehicle, it automatically is using the engine braking to regenerate electricity and charge your battery, right? And so most of the newer vehicles allow you to dial in how much of that you want. So it's kind of weird for you whenever you let off the accelerator, you're sort of lurching forward as the vehicle's braking for you. You can dial that back, but if you dial it all the way up to say, I'm basically going to go as I press the accelerator pedal, and as soon as I let off, most vehicles will almost come to a complete stop automatically. using that regenerative braking. So your brakes don't wear out as quickly on an electric vehicle as they do on an internal combustion engine either. So, I haven't seen studies kind of comparing total cost of ownership, year to year. Candidly, a lot of these electric vehicles haven't been around long enough to see, but the maintenance overall is lower. And because the software tends to drive a lot of these electric vehicles, most any of that sort of, technical issues you may have can be done over the air with a software update, right? And so that's much more convenient than having to take your vehicle into your dealer to get updates in the current environment we're in too.
That's great. And just from a technical side, my last question, maybe people don't understand that. Typically, I've got an engine, I've got a transmission, I've got a powertrain, and the energy is shifting from the up and down piston, or it's a V piston going, and they ship to a transmission, which goes to the powertrain. And there's the warm up. I go from 0 to 10 to 20 to 30. How is it that electric engines can go from 0 to 100 or 0 to 60 in 2 or 3 seconds, but it takes me on my Aviator 10 seconds?
Yeah, so it's just the efficiency with which the power is delivered, and increasingly it's the torque. So again, not to get too nerdy, but there's two metrics people talk about with traditional internal combustion engines. It's your horsepower, which everybody kind of says, oh, more horsepower is great. And then there's your torque. And torque is sort of, how much that power can, or how quickly that power can get applied. And so if you think of like a super duty vehicle, let's use your Ford, a Ford F-250 with their big diesel engine has over 1,000 pound-feet of torque, like super acceleration. That's a heavy vehicle. Batteries have very high torque, so they can apply that acceleration very quickly, and they don't have all the inefficiencies of those moving parts, right? You've got the engine pumping up and down, as you mentioned, to the powertrain, to the transmission, to the wheel hub, and all those are parts that are integrated, and you sort of lose efficiency along the way. Most of the electric vehicles, that engine is connected directly to the wheel, and it's instantaneous torque, instantaneous acceleration. So very different. And again, back to what I said earlier, that's what's appealing to a lot of people on electric vehicles, because it does drive differently, but in a good way.
Okay. Well, we've been talking with Jonathan Bauman on Meet the Expert. I'm Elliot Kallen of Prosperity Financial Group, 925-314-8503, or Elliot, ELLIOT, at Prosperity Financial Group. Jonathan's been our guest here. He's with American Century. We've talked about electric cars, sustainable energy, and so forth. Jonathan, thank you for being part of this today.
Yes, thank you for having me.
That's great. And we look forward to seeing you on another episode of Meet the Expert. Have a great day.